In this video, we will be looking at the conferences from 1945. We will start by looking at the Yalta Conference, followed by the Potsdam Conference. The Yalta Conference happened before the end of World War II, from the 4th to the 11th of February 1945. The big three leaders met at Yalta in modern-day Crimea to decide the shape of post-war Europe. The main aim was to agree on a post-war settlement and decide what to do with Germany once it had been defeated. The big three were Churchill from Britain, Roosevelt from the USA, and Stalin from the USSR. Each leader had different priorities in terms of what they wanted from the Yalta Conference. Churchill wanted to make sure that Britain kept its global empire and respect, and kept the pressure of the USA and the USSR over Britain reducing their empire at bay. Roosevelt wanted to make sure there would be peace after the war was over and ensure that the USA could rebuild its trade connections with the rest of the world. Roosevelt believed that this would make sure that an event like the Great Depression in the USA in the 1930s would never happen again. Roosevelt believed that an organisation of United Nations would be an effective way of peacekeeping. And finally, Stalin, he wanted the USSR to have a guarantee of security from the Western powers who were trying to move to enlarge their empires. Russia had been invaded 3 times by the West between 1914 and 1941. Stalin wanted a buffer zone of communist countries in Eastern Europe to make sure that Russia had that security from being invaded. In many ways, the conference in Yalta in February set the scene for the rest of Cold War Europe. At the end of the Yalta Conference, the big three had come to some agreements. Germany and its capital in Berlin would be divided into 4 zones of occupation. Britain, the USA, France, and the USSR would all control a zone. France was part of the conference as their leader, General de Gaulle, pressured the big three into letting them join, and Britain wanted a European ally to share the cost of the reconstruction of Germany after the war. Berlin was deep inside the Soviet zone, but all 4 powers would control a section of Berlin as well as a part of Germany. All countries freed from Nazi control were to be guaranteed the right to hold free elections and choose their government. Stalin was offered a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe. Stalin promised to join the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. All leaders made a commitment to hunt down Nazi war criminals, and the Allies agreed to setting up a United Nations, an organisation with the objective to ensure international cooperation and prevent future wars. The leaders of the USA, USSR and Britain met again in July 1945, after the end of World War II in Europe and after the defeat of Germany. The conference lasted from the 17th of July to the 2nd of August 1945, in Potsdam, Germany. The post-war leaders of the countries had changed. Britain's Churchill had been replaced by Attlee. Churchill was present at the start of the conference in Potsdam, but had to return to Britain for a general election before the conference ended. Churchill's Conservative Party was defeated and Attlee's Labour government was voted in. Attlee took over at the Potsdam Conference. Roosevelt had died towards the end of World War II and was replaced by his vice president, Truman. Stalin was still representing the USSR and was the only leader that was present for both the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. The main objective of the Potsdam Conference was to put into action the post-war settlement that was agreed previously at the Yalta Conference. While Yalta had been reasonably friendly between the leaders, it was a completely different case at Potsdam. The conference was full of disagreements, which was due to the significant changes that had taken place since the Yalta Conference. While Roosevelt had believed that cooperation with Stalin was essential so that the USSR would join the war against Japan and to encourage the USSR to be part of the United Nations organisation, Truman wasn't as keen to work with Stalin. Truman was very open about his dislike for communism and Stalin on a personal level. Truman ended the economic support the USA had been giving to the USSR through the Lend-Lease programme during World War II. This scheme helped the Allied nations of the USA that were short of money and resources during World War II. Truman began the conference with a positive view of Stalin, but became more impatient with Stalin after the news of the atomic bomb emerged. Just before the Potsdam Conference, on July 16, 1945, the USA had successfully exploded an atomic bomb in the desert. At Potsdam, Truman chose to inform Stalin that the USA possessed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. There was little real progress made at the Potsdam Conference, other than that the agreements put together in Yalta and the commitments made were put into action. At Yalta, it was decided that Germany and its capital, Berlin, were to be divided into 4 zones, with Britain, the USA, USSR and France all having control of each zone. While at Potsdam, there were arguments about where the boundaries between the zones would be drawn. In the previous conference at Yalta, it was decided that Stalin would have a sphere of influence over the countries in Eastern Europe, but all the countries that were freed from Nazi control would be allowed to have free elections and choose their own government. At Potsdam, there was no sign of Stalin allowing these free elections in Eastern Europe, and he had set up a communist government in Poland. Finally, it was decided at Yalta that the USSR would be allowed to take reparations, so money, from the defeated Germany. At Potsdam, this caused many arguments as to how the USSR should be allowed to, how much they would be allowed to take. It was agreed that the Soviets could take whatever they wanted from the Soviet-controlled zone and 10% from the western zones of Germany and Berlin. This continued to be a source of disagreement between the countries, with the Western Allies worried that they were repeating the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. The conferences led to many consequences between the USA and the USSR. Old mistrust between the countries returned. Relationships between Truman and Stalin worsened, as Truman disliked Stalin and wanted to act tough. The USA's successful test of the atomic bomb threatened the USSR. It was clear that the USSR wanted to control Eastern Europe, and Stalin said he needed friendly countries around him for protection. Truman saw the Soviets in Eastern Europe as an example of communist desires to take over Europe, and finally, the wartime Grand Alliance was ending.